Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It is such a joy to be here with you. It is a cold November day here in upstate New York. I'm hoping that you have somewhat better weather than I do, but we are approaching that time of year where things get a little darker, a little colder. And what better time to talk about our topic than now? The topic being, what do we call it? What it means to be patient when the world is on fire. So even though it's dark and cold, there is some sense of the world being figuratively and then sometimes literally, here's looking at you, California, on fire. I'll come back to that in a second, but I want to just place us in the arc of our Lojong slogans. So we've done a number of them so far. We've done about a fifth of them. And now we are entering what is known as the absolute teachings, the teachings on emptiness in the way that the Buddha taught, known as the Mahayana, greater vehicle. So he said, okay, there's emptiness, and there's also this other side of the coin, which is compassion. And we're entering these compassion teachings, known as the relative Mahayana. So the absolute Mahayana, teachings on emptiness, relative Mahayana, teachings on compassion. Two sides of the same coin. Like, we can't just negate the fact that we need to look at reality as it is, which are those teachings on emptiness. And we can't then say, well, that excuses us from not actually being nice and kind to people. That's actually very important. So they go together. So these slogans going forward are all going to be more about how do we actually apply some of the principles of compassion to our everyday life. And today's one is patience, which is interesting. So this talk today and then the next talk a couple weeks from now, both of them in November, revolve around patience. And for those of you following along in the Lojong slogans, we are in section 3 now for this month. And section 3 is often translated as transformation of bad circumstances into the path of enlightenment. Sounds pretty good. So the idea that we could transform whatever arises in our life. That we don't have to just say, oh, I'd like to be peaceful, and when I'm with the breath, then everything feels good. It's actually like even the not so good parts, the discomfort of our life, the painful aspects, the suffering that we encounter in ourselves and in others, that actually can be used as fodder for our own wakefulness. That it actually, and we'll talk much more in depth about what that means today, the idea that whatever is going on, even when the world is on fire, we say, oh, this is actually excellent opportunity for me to wake up my own mind and my own heart. So there are 6 slogans in this particular section on patience. We'll do 3 of them today, and we'll do 3 in 2 weeks' time. And in terms of starting with this idea of like the world is on fire, I don't know if I need to say a whole lot about this. I feel like more often than not, it is often in our face. There's some, like you turn on the news or you have alerts pop up on your phone or you open Facebook and all of a sudden there's something like, everything's going to shit, it's sort of like in your face. And it feels like we keep bouncing around. We say, okay, let's focus on, climate disasters. And now that's enough for one news cycle. Let's move into yet another story showcasing systemic racism. Okay, enough about that. Let's deal with immigration. And it's like our attention. There's never any like sitcom resolution to any of these things, right? It's not like we spend a week looking at the immigration crisis and then all of a sudden we're like, cool, it seems like everything's good there. Let's move on. It's like, no, that's still horrible, and we're going to pile on with something new. So it feels like for many of us that the world's on fire, that there's just so much going on, and it's really overwhelming. Setting aside maybe your personal world on fire, sort of like maybe a relationship dissolving or job trouble or whatever it might be, and the societal stuff, all of it sort of comes down into the realm of what we talked about in the second video when we talked about the cycle of suffering known as samsara, and that translation of samsara is an ocean of suffering, unendurable, unbearably intense. And that's sort of how it feels right now. Like things are really in our face and it feels pretty intense. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's often the sense of, we're really living in the Dark Age. That's what everyone says. Particularly when China invaded Tibet, they said, oh, this is the Dark Age. The signs of the Dark Age is that the teachings wane and no one actually really pays attention to them, that we're all prone to distraction. So there's a good argument for this being a Dark Age, although I honestly believe, when everyone was dying of the bubonic plague, I don't think everyone thought, well, this is not the Dark Age. I think they thought it was the Dark Age then too. So maybe it's just we always think that we're sort of at this point in our societal history where things look pretty bad. Anyway, the idea here is, yes, there is some sense that the world might be in trouble. So why would I ever sit here in front of you and say, now the best thing for us to do is to be patient? And patience actually here, I want to be very clear about our definitions around this word. I'm not saying lay down and do nothing. I'm not saying just wait for everything to magically get better. Patience is often treated in that notion of like, oh, just grin and bear it. That's how I feel like it's often talked about in Western culture. But that's not what we mean when we talk about it in Buddhism. And by the way, I'm going to preface all of this by saying out of all the various transcendental actions that we're going to talk about, ways of manifesting compassion, like patience or meditative concentration or exertion or whatever, everything that's coming up in the following months, out of all of the things that we're going to cover, patience is the thing I am the worst at. I'm very transparent about these things. I'm bad at patience. I've had like this business thing that was supposed to happen weeks ago and it hasn't happened yet. And I like wake up fuming about it sometimes. Like, I want it to be done. It's like there's nothing bad. It's just that my own impatience, and I have to look at my sense of impatience. And so it's not, oh, I'm just going to grin and bear it. It's like, obviously I should move things forward in the way that I can. But the idea here is like, that we actually have to look at our own sense of what makes us impatient. Can we actually be there with the emotion and not get so hooked by it? So we talked about this before in the emotions class, right? The fact that we could actually say, oh, this is just what's happening right now, as opposed to making it basically what I just said, which is I'm an impatient person, and then owning that and saying that's just part of my egoic identity now, and all that's not helpful for anyone. So we look at the impatience, but then at some point we let it go. And for those of you who are like, how do I do that? I want to remind you that in the guided recordings, the meditation, the folder of guided recordings that you have, there's the practice of RAIN, R-A-I-N. And that is a good practice for us to recognize the emotions, allow some space for them, investigate them, and then at some point not overly identify with them. Okay, tangent aside about how bad I am at patience. Thank you for being patient with me while I went on it. Patience, by the way, so the traditional Buddhist definition is that it's not something based in just waiting until you get to do what you want, or getting to do, getting your way some way with those people that you want to do things with. It's not about that. It's based in relating fully with the situation, even if it is a painful situation, even if that situation annoys the hell out of you. So being with things as they are. It's based, in some sense, it's based in not expecting anything. So we have to drop, part of this is we have to drop our fixed expectations and ideas of how and when things should be. That's what allows us to be patient. So you can think of patience as an act of being open to whatever comes your way. Open to the flow of how things will happen. Sharon Salzberg, I think it was in her book Real Happiness at Work, that she talked about travel and the mantra, it's not a mantra, it's a phrase that she uses when she's in travel situations, which is something will happen. And I love this about her because she makes it sound so easy. Well, when you're stuck in traffic and you're probably going to miss your flight, just say to yourself, something will happen. And it's true, something will happen. But what it's pointing at is this like ability for us to just be open to things as they are. If we are just sort of waiting on a subway train and we can't make that subway go any faster, we just sort of have to be open. Something's going to happen here. I will work with it when it arises. Like there's some sense of openness and ability to stay with our situation as is, as opposed to trying to fight against our situation. So there's some sense of, again, opening to the flow of how things are, or how things will happen. Not a wait and see perspective necessarily, but to be there, to just be with the situation as it is. I wonder if that's clear. We'll find out certainly in the monthly social. You can tell me that was not clear at all. But I am reminded, maybe Thich Nhat Hanh can help me here. He once said, when you love someone, the best thing you can offer is your presence. How can you love if you are not there? So maybe it's easier to describe this as an interpersonal thing. The idea that, like, classic example, you have a dinner reservation and your spouse is taking a very long time getting ready. And instead of saying, oh my God, we're going to miss our reservation, and sort of being really upset at them or inwardly fuming, you say, okay, I'm just going to be open to whatever arises. Whatever happens here, I will be okay with. Something's going to happen. I'm just going to be here with my person. So there's some sense of like offering our presence, offering ourselves as we are, without trying to struggle and fight about what could happen or what used to happen, to actually be present, to really be present with things in the moment. That is the Buddhist sense of patience. So I'm going to break this down because, it's nice to get really into different lists, and we'll talk about some of the slogans as well. But there's a book called A Torch Lighting the Way to Freedom, and it was written by Lojong Rinpoche, who was one of the really preeminent teachers and scholars in what's known as the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. Really amazing human being. He is a really amazing human being. Was. Sorry, he's passed. It's hard for me to keep track sometimes of all of the various ancient Buddhist masters and when they lived and when they did not live, because we have lost so many in the last 20 years. In any case, Lojong Rinpoche was an incredible scholar, and he wrote this book, A Torch Lighting the Way to Freedom, and it covers these various compassion activities, transcendental actions that we're talking about, so that he mentioned 3 ways that we could show up fully for our life in the vein of patience. And I'm just going to read this list, and it's a little controversial, so I'm warning you. The first one is patience in remaining imperturbable when wronged, and that sounds really effing annoying. I love this set of teachings, and I'm like, that sounds really hard. Patience in remaining imperturbable when wronged. So someone wrongs you. Someone makes you look bad. Someone slanders you. Someone makes an assumption about you. And the advice here is that this is a great opportunity for us to be patient. And there is an old Chinese proverb that goes, slander cannot destroy an honest man. When the flood recedes, the rock remains. The rock is there, I think is the traditional translation. But in either case, you understand the point here, which is that ultimately we can actually hold steady, hold firm to who we are. And even if someone says something bad or someone tries to wrong us, that's just a temporary flood, and then the waters recede. A lot of times when we feel wronged, we really rush to correct the situation. We want everyone to know that this is not the case, this is not what happened, they've got it wrong, I've got proof, whatever it might be. And I totally understand that. I completely understand that impulse. But sometimes the most powerful thing that we can do is nothing at all, to actually hold our seat and to let our actions and our being speak for us. So when someone wrongs us, the advice here is that we don't need to correct them or to lash out at them and make them look bad. This isn't that grin and bear it attitude that I made mention of before, but it is an allowing of enough space into a situation, sort of injecting space into a situation long enough to figure out how to respond in a manner that would actually be helpful to yourself and to others. So how do we do that? We pause. We don't just become reactive. We evaluate what's going on. We check in with ourselves. How am I feeling about this? We learn some of the emotional content around it. Sometimes we might even need to check in with other people. We might need to turn to someone we love and someone who we trust and say, hey, am I crazy here that I should do X, Y, and Z about this situation? They might be able to help us and offer advice. So when we feel like we're actually acting from a place of space as opposed to our neurosis and our reactivity, that's the moment that we then know how to act. But it's the idea of patience here is actually pausing long enough to actually understand the situation fully, particularly when we've been wronged. Now, out of the 3 slogans today, I'm going to jump into number 12 right now, and we'll come back to number 11, I promise. But number 12 says, drive all blames into one, which is an interesting one, because sometimes we might need to look at, someone's trying to wrong us, what of this can I own? What of this can I actually take on? Is there something I can learn from the situation? That we don't immediately just say, that person's wrong, I'm right. We say, well, let me look at this. Let me analyze and see, is there something going on here that I can look at? And this isn't, drive all blames into one isn't, let's drive all blames into me feeling bad about myself. This is like, oh, my egoic mind might have acted out and caused harm. I should look at that. I should learn that so that my egoic mind doesn't go there again. I don't end up causing harm from my neurosis. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen master, he recommended at one point writing the words, are you sure, on like a post-it note and posting it somewhere so that we could even just look and say, are you sure? Every time our egoic mind acts up and says, they're wrong and you're right and you should be vindicated, are you sure? Can we just look at our own body, speech, and mind, our activity, our ways that we interact with others, and the way that we hold our mind, to the extent that we might be able to say, oh, it's not, maybe I can learn something here, right? So there is some pausing and looking at ourselves in addition to looking at the situation. We're not immediately just laying blame on others. But again, this is also not about being silent and being a doormat. This is very much like we pause long enough to understand the skillful activity, and then we enter into the situation with our head on our shoulders, so to speak. So the second of these, the first one was patience in remaining imperturbable when wronged, and the slogan was drive all blames into one. And now we're going to do the second of these three aspects of Dojang Rinpoche. Still embarrassed that I didn't remember that he had passed. Patience in happily accepting suffering. What the fuck? Why would you ever want to be patient and happily accept suffering? What is he talking about here? I'm going to use an example. Many years ago, 2012, when I was working for a Buddhist nonprofit, doing development work for them, and they made large budget cuts, and they laid me off without any real advance notice. And having worked for that company for a number of years, my first instinct was, I got to do something, anything, really, just anything. I'm going to go online and look for job postings. I'm going to contact every lead I know. I'm going to complain about the supreme injustice of it all to anyone who's going to listen. I'm going to call up all these other people. And it's like, none of those things actually brought any sense of satisfaction or ground or joy. But eventually I realized that the best thing that I could do for myself in that moment was to offer myself the gift of space. Right? I didn't have the luxury to run off and take a long vacation or something, but just take enough time that I didn't freak out. So patience in happily accepting suffering. Now, obviously, jumping ahead, I said, oh, this is a moment that I can really go deeper with the things I actually care about and put all of my passions under one umbrella. And the umbrella is that I can actually be of benefit to others through really these meditation teachings. And I needed patience in order to accomplish any of this. So patience is easy to practice when you know something is going to happen eventually. Okay, eventually we're going to go to dinner. That's easy. It's an asset, though, when we don't actually know what's going to happen next. So when we feel like we've been dealt a bad card, or a bad hand, I suppose is the term, can we actually say, oh, no, this is a good opportunity for me to practice patience. This is like, oh, okay, is a very, like flipping the script here. That we're not just saying, this sucks and I'm going to get my way through it and that's patience. It's like, oh, something not good is happening. I realize this is a great time for me to learn patience. What an excellent opportunity that we can happily say, oh, if I didn't have a time to learn patience before, this is it. So the idea here is really holding our seat. Again, it keeps coming back to being present long enough to just see our way through to skillful activity. Part of which relates to the 11th of the Lojong slogan. So we skipped ahead, now we're picking up 11, don't worry. And the 11th slogan is, when the world is filled with evil, transform all mishaps into the path of Bodhi. Bodhi being open or awake. Wakefulness, essentially. Open-heartedness. So we don't merely react, right? We keep coming back to this notion in patience that we don't just merely react to whatever evil we perceive. Whatever big societal suffering is there, or whatever interpersonal suffering is with the job loss or the whatever, we say, okay, I'm going to see if I can drop my fixed view around this. The duality aspect of, oh, this is a good thing, this is a bad thing. Just be with this thing. Not for me or against me, just can I feel what is going on with me as I navigate this difficult circumstance. Difficult circumstance, again, personal, your own anxiety around something. Interpersonal, big relationship breakup, or societal. I'm overwhelmed by the news that is coming in my inbox today, whatever it might be. Whatever it is, we say, okay, it's tempting to say the world's just filled with evil. But if that's the case, if there is so much not goodness lurking outside our front door, can we transform that into the path of us waking up? Whatever obstacles come up in our path, whatever comes up in our personal, interpersonal, societal suffering, whatever it is, can we view it as an opportunity to connect with our own open heart? to not shut down and say, I'm going to hide from this right now, but to say, okay, I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here for this situation. That is the Buddhist notion of patience. I'm going to show up. It's not that you have the best plan or that you have it all figured out, but your willingness is, I'm going to show up and be present with mindfulness and compassion. So that's what we're talking about in this transformation process. There's a lot of shitty things happening, and I'm going to be here in the midst of it and hold my seat and be open. Transform all mishaps into the path of Bodhi. When the world is filled with evil, transform all mishaps into the path of Bodhi. So that's the practice that we can contemplate here. What does it mean to show up with an open heart, even when we feel like we've been dealt the bad hand or there's a lot going wrong with us or around us? And the third aspect of patience that Dudjom Rinpoche talks about is patience inspiring to a true nature of reality. A true knowledge of reality. Patience in aspiring to a true knowledge of reality, meaning that we could actually, brings us back to Do in terms of the absolute Mahayana teachings that we studied before. This final form of patience is based in aspiring to just be with life as it is. Not as we wish it would be. So we aspire to actually understand what is going on with us and with the world around us. So this reinforces the previous idea of being present with as much of your life as possible. I mean, it does feel like we're kicking a little bit of the dead horse with the patience game, but we're coming at it from different angles, of course. And when we're able to do that, we have a greater chance of seeing situations clearly and responding in a way that's in line with what's actually going on, as opposed to living based in our prejudiced notions and our fixed ideas of how things should be. And then as a result, we learn to offer compassion by simply being present to who and what is going on in front of us. That's the idea, to remain patient enough that we could actually respond with compassion. There isn't any like, okay, well, when this sort of natural disaster hits, we all do that. It's not that. It's training the mind to say, oh, can we really sink into the present moment long enough to not be reactive, to actually be really present for the people around us and ourselves, so that whatever is going on is part of our spiritual path. Bringing us to slogan 13, out of the 59 mind training slogans, Lojong slogans, be grateful to everyone. This is also sometimes translated as contemplate the great kindness of everyone. Either is fine. But my understanding of this is that instead of just focusing on our suffering and suffering, getting overwhelmed by suffering in general, what we don't have, we could actually focus on what we do. We could actually really genuinely appreciate the very basic things in our life. For me, I often in the morning will contemplate like just the fact that I can still see. It's a big deal. The fact that there are people who love me, that there is relative health in my family. Like these very basic things actually start to give me sustenance so that I feel that I can actually show up with an open heart in the other aspects of my life because there is some foundation there. So we do have to sort of turn our mind towards the things that are going right in our life, in our world, and that can help sustain us. And I'm going to come back to that word sustain in a moment, but the traditional translation and commentary on be grateful to everyone is that even when we find that there are circumstances that cause us suffering, or people who cause us suffering, we could be grateful to them because they actually help wake up our heart and mind. They give us something to practice. We couldn't practice patience without a really difficult person in our life testing it, right? So the idea is we should be really grateful to that person. What an awesome, horrible coworker that we have. That there's such a jerk that we get to practice patience. It's sort of that view. You see a lot of this in Buddhism, that it's like, oh good, something bad happened to you. What a great opportunity to practice. It's sort of like that. So, Trala Rinpoche, Tibetan Buddhist teacher, once said, we're only mature spiritually and psychologically when we are tested. That's the way that we mature, right? The idea that we only get better at practicing when things fall apart. And we feel a little groundless and we feel a little uncertain. We say, oh, I really have to rest here. I have to be patient. And then we really start to refine that particular tool in our tool belt. Another way that we could think about this comes from Pema Chodron, who says, if we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including the people who drive us crazy, can be our teacher. So we say, oh, what a wonderful teacher this obnoxious coworker is. They're really teaching me how to be patient. Isn't that wonderful? So we can actually wake up our heart to compassion in that way. I used the word sustain a moment ago, and I want to talk about hope and love in the midst of all this. So, okay, fine, the world's on fire. I admit it. Patience is going to help us take the long view, not just, grit and bear it, but to actually show up for our life and our world with a sense of openness and compassion, because we're not so reactive. We're not so lost in our fixed ways of doing and thinking. So we sit here, we learn patience, we actually hold our seat, again, I'll use that term, to the point that we can respond to whatever is arising in our life from a place of openness, compassion, kindness. And all of these are manifestations of love. So one last quote from a teacher, and then I want to actually do a bit of a reading, a little bit longer, from another. So His Holiness the Karmapa, who's the head of the Kagyu lineage of Tibetan Buddhism, his name is Ugyen Trinley Dorje, he once said, "Love can have an enduring quality when we make it a conscious spiritual practice." I love that. So it's a sense of like, oh, can we actually tap into the sense of love and openness that we have? And can that sustain us? Can we tap into that enduring, limitless quality of our love and our compassion to really allow us to ride the waves of our life? Even when things seem dire for ourselves or people in our life or society, can we actually tap into that sense of openness and love and let that sustain us through this hard time? So I'm going to read something from Sharon Salzberg on the topic of hope, because I think it sort of summarizes what we've been talking about here. And please be patient with me. It can be hard to have hope these days. We live in such difficult times that I've heard from many people that they feel almost frightened or foolish to hope that things in their world will be better. They and I have been alarmed and frightened by how much deceit and duplicity we see around us. It's been very hard not to get lost in the chaos, and it takes strength not to dwell there. And she goes on to say, hope is often about how we want the world to be, as if life would be perfect if only you could get that thing, that person or experience, or if the world were better in this or that way. One can get lost in this craving, which only increases separation from the world as it is. So in this tradition, meaning the Buddhist tradition, we try to see the world with equanimity instead of craving and fixation. Equanimity, this is what I mean when I say hold our seat. Equanimity reminds us that what is happening in front of us is not the end of the story, it is just what we can see. This too shall pass. So I love that sense that we actually can be patient and hold our seat, have that sense of equanimity long enough to notice this is just what's happening right now. She goes on to say, this leads to a different kind of hope, one that resides not in getting what we want, but in the way things actually are in this universe. Personally, I found a healing sense of hope in 3 places that are not attached to demanding a particular outcome. First, there is hope in remembering that over the course of my life, things have been bleak before, even bleaker than they are now. I am strong, and there is much within me that responds well to adversity. There is hope in that confidence. Second, in order to work for change in our personal lives or in the world, we need to find the ordinary things that can help sustain our energy and optimism. Finally, I find hope in my sense of community and the experience of bearing the tough times with others. Do the best you can, live according to your values and intentions, while knowing that you may not always succeed in your aspirations. Feelings of despair and inadequacy are part of the human condition. And when you find community with others, you know you are doing the best you can with what you have. So I do love that, and I love that we have this online community to support one another. And we have our accountability groups that we feel like maybe we can open up to and, even mention. It doesn't always have to be, I practice. It can also be, I'm having a hard time today. My mental weather is a little bit chaotic or is a little stormy. And that's great, that we can actually be open and with reality as it is. So this patience aspect gives us this enduring quality. It allows us to tap into a sense of love, into compassion, and to be with our world and our personal situation long enough to be skillful in how we show up for others from a place of harmony and joy. Thank you so much for continuing to practice and study, and I look forward to talking with you very soon. Take care.